welcome. It is a pleasure to have you at this event, which is the first collaboration that the Oxford Transitional Justice Group has with the Oxford Storage Critical Indigenous Studies Network. We have a fascinating seminar tonight, and I'll introduce our speaker in just 2 minutes after presenting the two groups. The Oxford Transitional Justice Group is an interdisciplinary network of academics and students who work in the area of transitional justice broadly defined. We take a variety of perspectives to transitional justice, from international law to criminology, area studies, socio-legal studies. We were founded in 2007, and we pride ourselves in having a very vibrant community here at Oxford. And I'm going to give the floor to Theodore to introduce the Critical Indigenous Studies Network.
Yes. Thank you very much for joining, everyone. So the Critical Indigenous Studies Network was created last year and is also an interdisciplinary network located at the Oxford Research Center in the Humanities. And it basically tries to tackle the big questions around the topic of indigeneity, be it like colonialism, colonial legacies, ongoing colonialism, decolonial methodologies, indigenous knowledge systems, and worldviews. And so we try to create like some discussion around these topics in Oxford and also beyond.
Mm-hmm. As I said, this is our first collaboration, and this is the best theme that we could have thought about for this seminar. So we're so pleased to have with us this evening Nancy Tuaine, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the tribal entity that is responsible for the implementation of the Te Tai Hauāuru Act from 2017. And this theme is going to combine different strands from domestic regulation of personality to environmental protection, and most importantly, Indigenous worldviews on these questions. So we're exceptionally happy to have you with us, Nancy. In terms of housekeeping, what we'll do is we'll have first a presentation from our speaker for about 20 to 25 minutes. And afterwards, we're going to have a Q&A session with the audience. For those of you who are online, please use the Q&A function on the Zoom meeting. And for those of you who are in person, just raise your hand and we're going to include you in the conversation. One point to make is that this webinar is going to be recorded, but only the talk itself will be recorded. The Q&A will not, so that we can have a very free and open discussion afterwards. With this, Nancy, the floor is yours, and thank you so much for being with us.
Tuana, ka hui manga I te pito te ka mau I tiki a taranga. Taka waira te matapuna me ngā kōrero me ngā wakapapa. E rere kauana nā tikanga o ki tīpuna I rōna riporipo nā naru o te awa o Whanganui. Taia te koutou ki te puna wai, ki te puna ora, ki te puna aroha tangaroa. Haungi e hui e tā ki e. Tēnā koutou katoa. Kone te Tuaine ahau no te awa o Whanganui. Te ati hau nui me nā tirangi nā iwi. Rua pehu te maunga. Tēnā koutou. So just started off our kōrero today, our conversation today, with a little bit of a ruruku. Paying homage to our mountains in the Central Plateau here of New Zealand, of the North Island of New Zealand, and to my river and to my ancestors that live within it. Thank you for having me participate in this first session for you as an organisation. I'm going to take you through a little bit of a presentation, as Theodore said, and then open it up for conversation afterwards, because I think that's the best way to explore your understanding in such a short time frame. So I'll just share my screen and hopefully it comes through okay. Everybody see that okay?
We can see it well, thank you.
Okay. So our iwi here has a long history of fighting for the rights of our river. Over 180 years, our people have gone through a series of actions and activities, and one of our karaua, he described it. And this was the late Sir Archie Whānau. He was the lead negotiator that myself and a couple of others worked alongside until his death in 2010. But he said, Sir Archie said, that Whanganui, we have sought to preserve our rights. We've protested, petitioned the Crown, and pursued our claims before numerous courts, tribunals. Such litigation has often seen issues narrowed, such as they are almost unrecognisable in Māori terms. And, you know, one of the biggest challenges for us as Indigenous peoples is the only place often to go and have your claims or your issues heard is before courts, and then you have to then be, I suppose, constrained by the principles within that court, which are not necessarily the same principles, values, or even, I suppose, outcomes that we would have if it was to be seen in our lens. So you can see what Sir Archie is talking about from our perspective. But what we've tried to do within the Whanganui River is find a way to navigate that. And the Te Tupua legislation and what we tried to achieve through that mechanism was to give most weight to our value system within the legal paradigm. So hopefully today you'll get a sense of that. I'm going to play a short video because I think it describes it really well in a short time frame that we have. So I'll just go into that video.
Ko tubua te kaua ko tau I te kaua ko te mātoi o te rangi tēnei rā te take. He runga mārua watu mā waka ke tia ki runga. Ko oru koe o ka tupuria he kauaura, he kauaura. In August 2014, Te Ati Haunui a Pāparangi signed a deed of settlement with the New Zealand government, which settled the long-standing claim our people have had over the Whanganui River for over a century and a half. The Whanganui River is the third longest river in New Zealand, at just over 300 kilometres in length. It drains approximately 7,000 square kilometres of geologically young and therefore erosion-prone hill country. The Whanganui rises on the western slopes of the Kāui Maunga, the mountains of the central volcanic plateau, where the headwaters have been tapped for the production of hydroelectricity via the Tongariro power scheme since the 1970s, something our people were not consulted over and continue to oppose. Beginning in the 1880s, laws were passed to force the physical removal of pātuna and utupiaro, eel and lamprey wares, to allow for the passage of river steamers into the interior of the North Island. In doing so, the government embarked on a less than subtle program aimed at undermining the reliance on, and therefore relationship, that the Whanganui tribes have had with the river for over 1,000 years. When I consider the history of Whanganui claim for the river, it has always essentially been about the same ancient edict of our old people. Kaua kai kōrero mō te awa, kōrero ki te awa. Do not merely speak of the river but address it directly. In March 2017, legislation was passed in the New Zealand House of Representatives that supported at law tupua te kaua, the innate values of the Whanganui River, as understood by the Indigenous peoples of this river. The result of the negotiations with the New Zealand government was to accord the Whanganui River the status of legal person. The The Whanganui River is now known as Te Hauāuru. We think it's really important to understand that legal personhood is really only the vehicle for carrying the fundamental rights of nature. The innate values of Te Hauāuru have been supported at law through this legal person. So if we take this view of the river, it's from the upper reaches, virgin forest, and the waters are clear and clean. And we're reminded that the river is both a physical as well as spiritual entity. So the first value that is part of the definition of this river now is ko te awa te mokopuna o te ora. The river is the source of spiritual and physical sustenance. So we have an emotional attachment with our rivers. We have a spiritual attachment, and all peoples can understand and share that. The second value is indivisibility. E rere kau mai te awa nui mai te kāwi maunga ki Tangaro. The great river flows from the mountains to the sea. If we are to address the river's issues, we must address it as a whole. If we are going to address what is best for the river, we must address it in its totality. We can't address it through its compartments. And I use this image because the child in the photograph is my paternal grandmother, and those are the people who adopted her and brought her up. They come from other parts of the river, and rather than viewing her as a subset of the whole, they brought her up and treated her as the whole that she is, the whole child that belongs to the whole tribe. And so it's a good example of an Indigenous way of thinking, of viewing somebody as a whole, of being able to view the river as a whole at the same time. And it's from that basis that we start to address those matters and those issues that afflict our river. And so this picture is of the old people who took the claim for our river beginning in the late 1920s. The third value relates to the place that Indigenous peoples have on our river, our tribe's long-standing relationship with the river, which is innate. We are inextricably intertwined and aligned with our river. We are the river and the river is us. So this journey has been a long one, but it's been one based on some fundamental principles. And so if we consider the river as both physical and spiritual, is indivisible, that indivisibility relates also to its Indigenous peoples. That gives us a solid foundation to move on and include the rest of our community in the thinking. And so this next image represents the communities coming together, the Indigenous community, the non-Indigenous community around Te Hauāuru, this new status for the river. And it speaks of the small and large streams that flow into one another, ngā manga iti, ngā manga nui e ono kauana. They flow into one another and form one river. And so really it's a call for all communities to come together under the definition of this new status for the river, this new legal person. So it's an inclusive proposition. Peoples of all identities are included because they use and live with the river. And so they're responsible for it. The paradigm has shifted to Indigenous values, to viewing the river at the centre of our relationship with natural resources, but nonetheless, it speaks of our obligation to work with the river and work for it, fundamentally, and then it can provide for all of us. So really that's it. Those four values, called tupua te kaua, define this new legal person. And it's really the values are the important thing to understand, because those values are the values that we want all communities to adopt. Indigenous values, but ones that are shared in the best interests of our river. And in doing that, we're according our river rights, but we're also stating that fundamentally the ones that need to uphold those rights are all peoples that use and interact with that river, regardless of whether we're Indigenous or non-Indigenous. We fought for 150 years or more to have our Indigenous view recognised at law. The law is a vehicle. The driver are the fundamental values that we express as Indigenous peoples on a daily basis. Te Māori ora, ki te Whānau, ki te ao marama. Kia ora.
So that video was presented by Gerard Albert. Gerard and I and our lawyer, Jamie Ferguson, were part of the negotiation team. And so Gerard describes the values of Tupua Te Kawa, and I'm going to go into those again just so that we can make sure we're focusing in on the things that make the biggest difference in terms of what we've achieved. And if we have a look back at the fight of our people, and we've got a number of times that we went into court, and you saw the picture of those korohike and koia, those old men and one woman, and in their time, of course, the only thing to go to court to have heard is whether or not you own something. And you will see through our workings to achieve Te Awa Tupua that we wanted to make sure that ownership was returned back to our awa, because in our iwi, in our tribe, and it's not the same for all of us. And, you know, often we're all generalised under the term of being Māori, but actually we're tribal people, and we all have, as tribes, different ways. One of our language differs, but also the way that we see things. And in our tribe, we don't own our rivers, our mountains, our forests. They own themselves out. We have an obligation to look after them, to care, protect them. So in our fight for the river, that's why we sought to get legal recognition for the river to exist in its own right. We'll just talk a little bit about that river though. So as Gerard described, it's the longest navigable river in Aotearoa, New Zealand, in the 1800s or early 1900s. One of the first legislations that the Crown implemented was the Coal Mines Act that took navigable rivers from us into their jurisdiction. And you would have seen that picture of the eelware being destroyed for navigational purposes by steamers had a significant impact on us as a people, as that was our food source. And I talked to young people, rangatahi, recently, and I told them it's just like blowing up Pack and Save, Countdown. Those are our supermarkets here in New Zealand, all in one day. There's the food source that we once knew or got taken away from us. Anyway, large catchments from the mountains of the Central Plateau to the sea. Te Awa Tupua includes all iwi whose tributaries feed into the Whanganui River. The catchment of Te Awa Tupua has 3 district councils, 1 regional council, and a range of interests: recreational, environmental, tourism, agricultural interests across that. And in the video, I talked about power generation. So 5 of the streams and the headwaters of the Whanganui River diverted on the western side of the mountains for the Tongariro Power Development Scheme. That's a scheme that extracts the waters from the headwaters and takes them over through a hydroelectricity scheme into Lake Taupo. And you can see Lake Taupo in the top right hand of that picture there. So that's the effect on the western diversion, and particularly in Te Awa Tupua. But on the eastern diversion, it takes 22 streams, and it's all diverted through the Power Development Scheme out into Lake Taupo. So from our perspective, the significant impact on the rivers, on the river and the rivers, because we consider it to be consumptive. It doesn't come back. It might be called, restorative or regenerative electricity, but for us it's consumptive because it doesn't feed our river system. Anyway, I could go on about that for another hour or so. I want to talk through the values more and actually really reinforce what makes this different for us. So I'm just going to go through them again. Te kawa tuatahi, the first value called Te awa te matapuna o te ora. So the river is our source of spiritual and physical sustenance. Tawatupua is a spiritual and physical entity that supports and sustains both the life and natural resources within the river and the health and well-being of our iwi, hapu and other communities of the river. And we were going through our treaty claims process with the Crown. All of our people talked about the different things that our river meant to us. We used it for our spiritual practices, for birthing tamariki, for healing, for, of course, to feed our people. And it just has such a big importance for us in terms of our health and well-being. And for us, if the river is sick, then we are sick. And this interconnectedness is why we sought to have this recognition for the river and its importance to us as a people. We met to many tribunals, planning hearings, and represented ourselves all the time for people to understand that importance and its centrality to our lifestyles. Ko te kawa tuarua e re kau mai tawanui mai I te ka hui mange ki Tangaroa. The great river flows from the mountains to the sea. Te awa tupu is indivisible and a living whole from the mountains to the sea, incorporating the river in all its physical and metaphysical elements. And if you understand the Resource Management Act of New Zealand, when you're going to get a consent to use water or discharge, then usually it would pertain to that area or source where you were going to do your activity. Many times we had to fight in those processes to get recognition of upstream or downstream impacts from that. Now we don't have to appear anymore to have recognition that this is a living whole from the mountains to the sea, that when you're doing things or wanting to do things, you have to understand what the impacts are, upstream, downstream. You have to talk to the people around you, understand what that is. And metaphysical for us, the life source of this awa. And that's why extracting the waters of significance to us, because it creates some balance in that space. The next value, ko te kawa tuaturu koai tawa ko tawa koai. I am the river and the river is me. The iwi and hapu of the river have an inalienable interconnection with and responsibility to te awa tupua and its health and well-being. As before, whenever we went to tell our story or to represent the interests of the river in a tribunal or consent hearing, we'd always have to repeat ourselves and ask for a voice to be heard. We always had to present and say we are the descendants of the Whanganui River, and this is who we are and this is where we live, and numerous accounts of our old people presenting before different various entities, planning regimes, courts, and always having to retell their story. Now we don't have to do that anymore. In legislation, it is enshrined that we are the river and the river is us, and we have a right to be heard. And we are a critical part of deciding the future of the health and well-being of our river now. Ko te kawa tuatwa, the fourth value. Nā manga iti, nā manga nui e hono hono kawa na kātupu hei awa tupua. The small and large streams that flow into one another form one river. Te awa tupua is a singular entity comprised of many elements and communities working collaboratively for the common purpose of the health and well-being of Te Awa. So now we have recognition that everybody, whoever lives alongside the awa, the river, whether you live by a small stream or a large stream, you are within the catchment that makes it whole and healthy. You are all contributing to its outcome, its health and well-being outcome. And so it requires then a process of inclusion. And through our settlement, we've established, we didn't seek to repeat what councils do. We would never have the capacity, nor would we want to do all of the things, the legislative or planning responsibilities that they have. But what we did seek to do is to set strategy. So anybody that has a role, responsibility to perform duties must adhere to the strategy. Te Hauāuru is a strategy. And in the setting and establishment of the strategy group, Te Kōpoka is its name, we sought to include everybody in all of those interests that were listed when we had a look at the map, the district councils, the regional council, all of the other interests, all of the iwi are participating now in the strategy group, and they set the strategy for Te Awa that people must adhere to. So those 4 values collectively called Tupua Te Kawa now guide everything that happens within our river system. Legal status, so Te Awa, the legal person, has all the rights and powers and duties and liabilities of a legal person. I'm not a lawyer. Before we get in and open the questions up, so don't get too legalistic with me, but I am someone who has worked on this for a long time. But the rights and powers and duties of Te Awa must be exercised and performed, and responsibilities for its liabilities must be taken by Te Pautupua. So Te Pautupua, I'll talk to you about them shortly. The legal effect though, so attached to our legislation is a schedule of all of the government acts that must recognise and provide for Te Awa. So the legal effect applies to persons exercising or performing a function, power or duty described in the Act. Those are listed in Clause 1 of Schedule 1. There's about 25 government acts. They must recognise and provide for Te Awa status and Tupua Te Kawa. So those value systems are now people, entities that have these responsibilities. They must recognise and provide for our values now enshrined in legislation. And then there's a small subset of acts that in Schedule 2 need to have particular regard to, and you'll know language means everything. So different weightings applied. But to achieve, must recognise and provide for was a significant achievement for us as a people. One of a researcher that completed research on the legislation, she commented that Te Awa status gives legal effect to be interpreted in a manner that best provides for the Indigenous views and therefore ask others to colonise the way in which they have previously acted and thought of our river system. And just before I open it up, the last slide is going to just talk briefly about Te Pautupua. So Te Pautupua is the human face. They act in the name of Te Awa. They exercise its functions. They must act in the interest of Te Awa and consistently with Tupua Te Kawa, the value system. their functions are to speak on behalf of Te Tupua, uphold the status, promote, protect the health and well-being of Te Tupua, except as otherwise provided for, exercise landowner functions in relation to the land vested in Te Tupua. So the Crown was able to vest the parts of the navigable parts of the river that it's still held in its ownership in Te Tupua, and therefore Te Tupua now becomes the land owner, or expresses and exercises those rights on behalf of Te Tupua. The Crown also gave a restoration fund, it's called Te Korotete, of $30 million. So that fund, anybody who is looking to do restoration work across the catchment is able to apply to, and they can take any other reasonable necessary action to achieve the purposes and exercise its functions. At the moment, the two people that are shown in the photograph, Tura Mahahawira and Kiria Punga, the Pautupua. So they're two people, but they must act as one to be Te Pautupua, one nominated by the Crown and one by us and those other iwi that have interest in Te Tupua, but we must both agree to that appointment process, and they must both be representative of the interests of the river, not our individual interests. So that's the role and function of Te Tupua. I think I'll stop talking now and open us up for questions. I'll just take this huge screen off.
So much, Nancy, for this presentation. We're now going to stop the recording.